Some people you want me to start?
Go ahead, Ann.
Great. Thank you very much. Hi, this is Ann Beaudry. A number of you I met when I was a vice president at SHOT, and even though I have left working there full-time, I continue to work as a consultant to the OTL campaign, and I thank all of you for coming today, and particularly for our two panelists, Kurt Wise and Patrick Bresette, for joining us. The emphasis today, and Jocelyn's going to go quickly through these slides, if you'll move to the next one, Jocelyn, is to begin to focus on the revenue side of the budget. And one of the things we wanted to emphasize to you is if you have questions, you can see the chat feature that's on the bottom right side of your screen. And there's a point in Kurt Wise's presentation when he's going to stop for questions. If you have them, type them in there, and we will try to address them as we go through this webinar. Please remember, though, because you may have questions as we go through this. It's a lot of numbers, and we're covering a lot of ground today. If you do not get your question answered, send an email to info@otlcampaign.org. And working with Jocelyn in the SHOT Foundation office, we will get an answer to your question and get it back to you. So please make use of the chat feature on the screen as we go through the webinar. And at the end, please don't hesitate to send questions that you may have that don't get answered. And Jocelyn will, at the end of this, give all of you a reminder about the second part of this webinar, which is also another chance to get your questions answered. Jocelyn, the slide. Great. And one of the key things in terms of sort of focusing on this and sort of why revenue, if you want to do the next slide, please. Many of you are obviously working on fair funding, and that's Justin, you want to put the whole slide up? It's a very important part of this, and many of you are working on sort of the equitable funding formula, and it's a really important one. But as you'll see from the next slide, it's a really important thing to begin talking about revenue, because fair funding is not the same as sufficient funding. Jocelyn, you want to hit the slide? If you want to bring them all up, please. Not only if you divide a too small pie fairly, it still can leave everyone hungry, which we think is a good metaphor for this. And there are many reforms that have been adapted, but additional funding will require new revenue, and that's really the focus of this webinar. The next slide, Jocelyn. And we're particularly focused in terms of state funding, and many of you may ask, sort of why. One of the things, as you can see, is that K-12 education is the largest single category of state expenditures. And the reason that we need to talk about new revenue is that just looking at budgets as they are, existing budgets, and looking at shifts is not really a highly likely place or even a very desirable place to get additional funding for K-12 education, other than perhaps, the corrections budget, which we would all like to minimize and lessen the school-to-prison pipeline. But it's very important not to approach trying to get money for education as a zero-sum game that just looks at these shifts, and this is the reason. Jocelyn, the next slide. The next one, please. One of the things to focus on is why particularly now have we, teamed up with Mass Budget and Policy Center in terms of revenue. And one of the things that you can see very clearly in this slide is that since the Great Recession started in 2008, there have been significant declines in per pupil expenditures in terms of education, more than 10% lower in 13 different states, and 36 overall have a total decline. As these declines are measured in dollar terms, there's really very few. Some of it's up as much as $1,200, $1,300 per student, and even where there are increases, they end up being very small ones of only a handful of states, increasing by $100 to $200 per pupil. Next slide. The obvious result of one of this is not only what happens in terms of the declining educational opportunities for our most vulnerable students. Of course, there's a significant decline in public education employees. There's been more than 324,000 education jobs that have been lost nationally since I'm sorry, since 2008. You know, and in some, public education has been very hard hit by the Great Recession. And for many states, just returning to the pre-2008 levels is going to be a really significant challenge. Jocelyn, the next slide. Next slide. One of the key things here is that federal funding is per pupil is fairly consistent from state to state, but nationwide, the state funding, and it's the reason we're focusing on it today, is actually a really significant share of the K through 12 expenditures. The percentage of that money that is coming from state governments. In almost all of states in the nation, the state funding for K through 12 public education, at least at a third of the total cost, is provided by all states, and in many states that rises to more than a half. There's a few states that it's 80%. And the really critical things, as you can see in the next slide, is that the amount of money that goes in for state funding makes that be a really essential issue. But the other reason that we're focused on state funding is fairness. The FAIR formulas can, in fact, help level the playing field because many local communities, particularly very low-income communities, those with a low property tax base, do not have the same amount of funding, obviously, as wealthy communities, and in many, it's really not even sufficient at all. It's not adequate to be able to provide a quality education and give all children an opportunity to learn. This webinar today, because we are talking about budgets, means there's a lot of numbers. We're also going to be covering, and we're very thankful to have Patrick Bresette from Public Works with us as well, talking about a critical underpinning of those numbers, which is the messaging to be able to build public will. But before we dive into that, and I'd really like to turn just very quickly to a short video that shows education advocates in this kind of organizing on education and taxes, a fight on the ground. And this is a short video about education advocates in New York. And the slide starts. Thank you. I hope you all enjoyed the Get on the Bus video. And I'd now like to turn this over to Kurt Wise, who is with the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. And this is, as I said, the first of 2 webinars designed to give you the facts about taxes so that you can feel much more confident about waging budget campaigns in your state. And I think you'll find that the confidence will come from knowing the facts that, in fact, Kurt's going to lead us now through, and buttressed by the messaging we'll hear later from Patrick Bresette. Kurt?
Great. Thank you, Anne. So as I think that video demonstrated, people who are going to be engaged in revenue campaigns are going to have to expect there's going to be some pushback. Anybody who's worked on a revenue campaign knows how true that is. Anne mentioned facts, and something that's helpful in all this is that we have the facts on our side. So for the last several minutes, Anne has helped us understand why increased school funding will require new revenue. And we should be clear that when we say new revenue, what we're actually talking about here is additional taxes. Unfortunately, because even the word taxes has become so unpopular, we often start these debates at a disadvantage. But again, we have the facts on our side. So with that in mind, let's take a few minutes to look more closely at some of the connections between, 1, tax levels, and state economic performance, and then 2, education levels and state economic performance. So let's start with the connection between state and local tax levels and a state's economic performance. Now, we often hear politicians and lobbyists declare that high taxes weaken the economy. The suggestion is that while everyone would love to invest more in schools and other essential public functions, the tax levels required to sustain these investments would undermine a state's economic vitality. In fact, the evidence doesn't support this claim. Instead, there's no clear relationship between a state's tax levels and how well its economy performs for the working families in that state. Within reasonable limits, higher tax levels do not produce a measurable drag on state economic performance. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's instead look directly at the data. So a good measure for state economic performance is whether the economy is delivering good wages for working people. And here in this chart, we see median hourly wages on the vertical axis and total state and local taxes as a share of personal income on the horizontal axis here. That's along the bottom there. And in a moment, we're going to put every state up on this chart and see where they land. So if higher tax levels really do produce a weak economy, we should expect to see the states clustered tightly around a trend line running downward from left to right, like this. But that's not what we see. Instead, what we see is no pattern at all. There's no clear trend line here. Instead, the states are scattered all over the chart. And it's not surprising that there's no clear relationship between a state's tax level and how strong its economy is. This is consistent with most of the economic literature. Other factors are simply more important to the strength of the economy than our taxes. But maybe it's the case that with 50 different states, there's really no single policy choice or public investment that would produce similar results across the board. Well, we can test that theory by looking at educational levels and wages, and we're going to do that in this next set of slides. So we're giving away the punchline at the beginning here. When we look at the data, what we find is that there is a lot of evidence that shows that the level of education of a state's workforce is closely connected to a state's economic performance, and that it is a far more important factor than our state and local tax levels. Simply put, states with better educated workers have stronger, more vibrant economies that deliver significantly higher wages for working families. So let's, again, look at some data. Here again, we see median hourly wages measured along the vertical axis at the left, and on the horizontal axis below, we see the percent of the workforce with a bachelor's degree or higher. So in a moment, we're going to put the states up in this chart, and what you're going to see is that states with a less educated workforce have lower median wages, while those with a highly educated workforce have high wages, wages that are $4, $5, and even $6 an hour higher on average than states with lower levels of education. That's a big wage difference. So let's look at the data. And here we have it, as described, with states clustered tightly along a trend line with a pretty steep pitch to that trend line. This chart shows a strong correlation between education and wages. With the exception of 2 natural resource-rich states, Wyoming and Alaska, there are no outliers. Despite all kinds of policy approaches that states have adopted to boost their economic development, oftentimes focused on tax cuts for business and high-end earners, there's not a single example of a less educated, non-oil-rich state delivering high median wages. So what's the takeaway here? Quality public education is essential to a state economy in today's world. But it's worth noting that this has not always been so clearly the case. Our economy and the world economy has changed over the last generation. Here we're looking at the same type of graph with similar axes, median hourly wages on the left and education levels now below on the horizontal axis. But now we're going to look at data from 1979. And what we find is that 35 years ago, states with better educated workforces did not uniformly deliver higher wages to their workers. So let's look at that data. You can see that the states are not clustered as tightly around the trend line, and the trend line does not rise at as steep an angle. There are examples of high-wage, non-oil-rich states that have a relatively less educated workforce, like Michigan and Ohio. And there are states with better educated workforces with relatively low median wages, like Vermont, New Hampshire, and Virginia. For much of the post-World War II boom up until the 1980s, there were many good-paying, blue-collar jobs in manufacturing and mining and other industries. So a big part of the reason these jobs paid so well was that unions were much stronger during this period. Other factors, of course, also played a role. Today, however, as we've seen already, and again now we're looking at the 2012 data, investing in high-quality education for a state's future workers is key to building a prosperous state economy. Despite the fact that this shift has been underway for 2 decades and more, it is just now becoming widely known and accepted among policymakers and the general public. So let me pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions before we move on. I'm sorry, so there's a chat box along the right-hand side of the screen, and you can type things in if you want to. But let's see if there are any questions. Jocelyn, is there anything popping up there? Great, so you can save those questions if you have them, and we can answer them again at another break or at the end, or as Ann mentioned, you can send those to Jocelyn, and we can get them answered after the webinar as well.
And Kurt, this is Ann. I just wanted to let you know that I am not seeing the chat box on my screen, and it may be that Jocelyn will just want to check to make sure that that's not the case for some other participants. So
we heard that, and I think Jocelyn has taken a quick look at it.
Great. Okay, thanks. There, go ahead, please.
Great. So maybe we'll stop again if that pops up and people have more questions. We'll tackle those a little bit later. But now I'd like to turn to tax fairness. We can have the next slide. Later in this webinar, and more in part 2 webinar that's going to take place in 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking about various specific revenue-raising options. And all the options that we're going to look at not only raise new revenue, but do so in a way that makes the overall tax system more fair. So we want to talk about tax fairness, but to do that, we have to begin by talking a little bit about tax systems. A tax system is the full set of different kinds of taxes used to collect revenue by a given level of government, be that a local, a state, or the federal government. And there are 4 basic concepts or criteria by which a tax system can be judged. So let's take a quick look at those now. So first, the tax system should be adequate. It should deliver the amount of revenue that is necessary to provide the programs and services that people expect and desire. It should also be stable, meaning it should provide a consistent and predictable amount of revenue year to year to make budgeting a little easier. It should be simple and efficient, and that's fairly self-explanatory, so I'm not even going to go into that in any depth. And it should be fair. And that one is a little more complicated, and we're going to spend some time on that now. So most people agree that a tax system should be fair, but people don't always agree on what fair means. Some people think a fair system is one that collects a smaller percentage of household income from low and middle income families than it does from high income families. A system like that would be called a progressive structure. Other people think a fair system is one where everyone pays the same percentage of their household income, whether that's 5 or 7 or 10%, for example, regardless of how much a family earns. That's called a proportional structure, and some people feel that that's the fairest. Very few people argue that a fair system is one where low-income families pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes than high-income families do. That kind of structure is called a regressive structure. So with these concepts in mind, let's dig a bit deeper into the question of fairness by taking a quick look at the 3 major types of taxes collected by state and local governments in the U.S., the property tax, the sales tax, and the personal income tax. For each type of tax, we're going to look at how it affects people at different income levels and see whether the tax is progressive, proportional, or regressive. So let's start by orienting ourselves to the kind of charts we're going to look at for the next several slides. And here it is up on your screen. And along the vertical axis to the left is the share of a family's income collected in taxes. And then along the horizontal axis at the bottom, we have families grouped by income into quintiles, or fifths. So families in the lowest income quintile, those with the lowest 20% of incomes, are at the far left. The middle income quintile is in the middle. And those with the highest incomes, the top 20% of all families, are at the right. And that top income quintile is broken out into the top 1%, the next 4%, and the next 15%, so we can get a finer grain look at how various taxes affect folks at the top end of the income distribution. So again, we're going to look at the 3 major types of state and local taxes, and what that means is that we're not looking at any federal taxes in this, just state and local taxes, to see how each tax affects families at these different income levels. And again, these are averages for the U.S. as a whole. So these aren't necessarily true for any specific state, and the different amounts can vary depending on the state that we're looking at. But in general, these are pretty good indicators of how things look in different states, and largely hold true at the individual state level throughout the country. So first, let's look at the property tax, a tax that most often is collected at the local or county level. And as it turns out, the property tax typically is regressive. So let's look at that. So as you can see, lower income families, on average in the U.S., pay a larger share of their income toward property taxes than high income families do. So that makes the property tax a regressive tax, generally speaking. Now let's look at sales and excise taxes. Sales taxes are the tax we pay at the cash register when we purchase many kinds of goods and some kinds of services. The amount of tax is usually based on the value of the purchase we're making. Excise taxes are very much like sales taxes, but they're applied to a specific product and usually on a per unit basis. For example, a tax on a pack of cigarettes or a gallon of gas. Sales and excise taxes often are collected at the state level, though sometimes they're collected at the county or even at the local level. And let's take a look at those. So as you can see, sales and excise taxes are even more regressive than property taxes, affecting lower income households much more significantly than upper income households. And finally, let's take a look at the personal income tax, a set of taxes collected on various forms of income, including wage and salary, capital gains income, and dividends and interest income. 41 states levy broad-based income taxes, and these taxes typically are collected at the state level. And as you can see, the pattern here is quite different than with property and sales and excise taxes. On average, lower income families are paying significantly less of their income in this type of tax than higher income families do. This outcome, with lower income families paying a smaller share of income than high income families do, makes the personal income tax the only major tax type that is progressive in its net effect. So that's worth just keeping in mind later when we're talking about how to raise revenue in a progressive manner, that the personal income tax is the one major progressive tax in the overall tax system. So let's see what happens when we combine all the various types of state and local taxes together. Will the system be regressive or progressive overall? And let's take a look. Well, you can see that here, even with the notable progressivity of the personal income tax that we saw in the last slide, overall, the combined state and local tax systems in the U.S. are sharply regressive. Low-income families pay almost twice as large a share of their family income in state and local taxes as high-income families do. This information is going to be important to keep in mind when you think about ways to raise new revenue. While we want to increase the tax revenues available for important public investments like K-12 education, we also want to raise those additional dollars in a way that improves the overall fairness of our tax system. So once again, I want to stop for a minute, pause to see if there are any questions.
And just so everyone knows, the chat box, if you put your arrow up towards the top of the screen, the chat box should pop up from the top of your screen.
Jocelyn, where is that arrow? Just say it again, please.
If you put your cursor towards the top of the screen, you should have something that pops down and allows you to open up the chat box.
Under window? No.
We do have one question from Nathan. He is asking, how do we make the specific argument for supporting high levels of funding for public schools?
Well, I think that that may be a good question to tackle after we hear from our next speaker, who's going to talk a little bit about messaging. So maybe we'll turn to Patrick first, and then return to that question afterwards. If that still seems like a question that lingers. Does that seem like a way to approach it?
Sure. We have another question from Howard, who's asking, do you believe more and more courts will correct the iniquity of the current system? Kansas, of course, just ruled recently that the public school funding system was inequitable and has ordered the state's legislators to basically put together a whole new funding formula for the state.
Well, again, I mean, I think that inequity is a somewhat separate question from sufficiency. It sounds like there's a lot of work to do on questions of equity, and Anne can probably speak more in a more informed manner to that question. The courts are unlikely to address the question of adequacy in terms of generating enough revenue to pay for the various kinds of programs that we're looking for in K-12 education.
If I could just jump in there, Kurt, this is Anne, and it's absolutely true. Whether it has been done, ordered by the court, as is true in New York, or whether or not the court has ordered the legislature to do things, as has happened in many states, we have these court cases going on. One of the problems that happens is even in some cases where we are able to get fair funding, because we have an austerity and a tax-cutting mentality that's sort of ruling at this point, we're ending up with fewer and fewer dollars. So even in some cases, the fair funding formulas are not going to be able to deliver adequacy. So whereas the scope of this particular webinar is really to try to help people focus on how can we, not only education advocates, but our feeling is that there's a lot of common ground to be developed with other people who are advocates for services and things for people who are very vulnerable in this society, to try to look at how do we actually move the needle and be able to talk about raising taxes so that there's a greater, pie to be distributed here.
So it looks like there's a question about income taxes in Texas and asking whether there's a move to create an income tax in Texas. That is a great question that can be answered, and I'm sure answered much better by some specific folks in Texas who I can direct you to, and at the later part, another segment of today's webinar, we're going to look at how to connect to some of these really great groups in your states throughout the country. So we'll return to that question, in 10, 15 minutes.
All right, I think that's it for questions at the moment. If you've got more questions, feel free to hang on to them, and we'll get back to them pretty soon. We're going to hand this over to Patrick Bresette.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm joining you from Texas, where while Public Works is kind of a national organization, many of us work from various places around the country, and I'm near Austin today. So I wanted to briefly give participants in this webinar an overview of our work on how the American public thinks and reasons about government and about taxes. There's much more about this on our website, including some things you can download, materials to look at, some annotated presentations. So while I'll go through a small set of slides here, our website has a lot more that might be interesting to those who are on this call. Jocelyn, can I go to our little mission slide there?
Yep.
So Public Works has been around for about a decade. We have been really dedicated to trying to change the conversation about the role of government in our society and push back against the kind of knee-jerk, anti-government, anti-tax rhetoric and movement that's out there. I think for the purposes of today's conversation, and next slide please, Jocelyn. I think we kind of all know this instinctively, but the kind of dominant perceptions about government are often front and center when we're trying to have conversations about the need for revenue. So while the conversation may be ostensibly about taxes or new funding for something, the backdrop is often the kind of underlying attitudes that people carry around with them about the public sector. And so let's talk about a couple of those. Next. First and foremost, what we have found, and this probably resonates with people listening in, is that most people really have a notion of government as being just about politics, and that kind of dominant sense that it's just a lot of political partisan bickering, and a very vivid image of kind of fighting politicians tends to crowd out any other kind of awareness of the day-to-day work of government, and it is all seen as just a political sport, if you will. Next. And so you see cartoons like this, where people view tax day as somehow being shaken down for money that's going to those bickering politicians. And again, not really thinking a lot about, on a day-to-day basis, where that money goes, other than if someone is some politician they may not like is trying to take it away from them. The next image that is often right there next to this kind of vivid political one, next slide, Jocelyn, is a blurry one at best. So a lot of people that we have dealt with, and I think most people around the country, busy with their lives, doing their job, taking care of their kids, don't really think much about the work of government on a day-to-day basis. And so it does seem mostly like some large bureaucratic blob that they can't really quite get their hands around or describe in an articulate way. People have a hard time estimating, kind of how many people work for government, even in their communities or nationally, and have wildly divergent numbers about that. Even asked to kind of name a few key state or county agencies and what they do, people struggle with that. So we're really also dealing with a dominant image that it's just a big invisible bureaucracy, and then that again bleeds over into the way people think about where those revenues are going. So another cartoon in the next slide gives you a sense of that. So this poor guy working away on his taxes, his only kind of real relationship to government is this big invisible entity taking away his money that apparently the Lord has given him. Next slide that we have is another perception about government that is kind of deeply cultural and one that really emerged in our research, and that is that people have come to view their relationship to government almost like their relationship with a vending machine. They should decide how much money to put in, and they want to be able to choose what they get out or do not get out. And so I'll take the Doritos but not the cookies, or particularly of interest in this conversation, I'm sure people have heard an argument like this. Well, my kids aren't in school anymore, so why should I pay that increased local levy for the local school system? And all that really springs from kind of a consumerist mindset where the primary concern is what's it going to cost me personally, and what's in it for me if I actually put in some of my hard-earned money. And so as you'll see in this next slide, it's very easy in these conversations to trigger that kind of consumer thinking. And related to a question that someone asked earlier, one of our challenges is to get people to remember the kind of core and fundamental public purposes that are behind something like public education, that it's not just about the money by itself going into some invisible entity, but really about how we build a good society. So the next slide, just to wrap up a couple of these thoughts here, we also explored in our research, and then we do quite a bit of work at this around the country, is to help people think about how to tell new stories about government that do not trigger these dominant frames and stereotypes. And I'm not going to go into them in a lot of detail right now. As I said, you can find more information on our website. But there are three kind of core themes we need to work on. If one of the challenges is that people see government as just politics, we have to help them remember what government is actually for. Why do you create a public system in a functioning society? Whatever its core mission and purpose to make things function well, make communities strong, et cetera. That second challenge about a big bureaucracy that people have very little knowledge about, it's really on us to help educate people and help them remember that we are surrounded every day by myriad public systems that make life possible and make our quality of life better when they're supported. And lastly, how do we continually reinforce notions of civic thinking and not just consumer thinking that gets in the way? And we have all kinds of tools for thinking about how you might embed those ideas in your work. The next slide, Jocelyn, is how then to take some of these thoughts and think about how we specifically talk about the need for revenue. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of that and a few thoughts about going forward that we can again address a little bit more later on. So first and foremost, the slide here with Uncle Sam, the next slide with Uncle Sam pickpocketing, is the simplest way to describe what we found in our research about how people think about taxes. They do see it as primarily money that is taken away from them by some external entity known as government, and they will even use terms such as theft in talking about taxes. So that's certainly not a great place to begin. Next, when we dug deeper into this research and tried to really probe in conversations with people about why that was their kind of top of mind response, it was clear that people really have a difficult time connecting taxes to what they pay for, and they have become disconnected from the purpose of tax. And a lot of the conversations that we end up in with the public do sound like we're just talking about the tax itself and about the money and the rates and how much funding we need. And so you get the kind of general reply out in the public to this next photograph that a friend of mine marked up. where you have people protesting against taxes completely surrounded by public systems that their taxes pay for. And that may be funny if it wasn't also so painful about what we have to deal with in this work. Next slide. So a core challenge when we're trying to talk about revenue and the need for new taxes or additional taxes to support a system like public education is to really enter that conversation by helping people remember what it's for. Why are we in the need for new revenue? And I think Kirk gave some great examples of what the data tells us about investing in public education and what we get back in the way of a strong economy and a healthy society. But we have to have that kind of value type of a conversation with people and not have it just be about the money. Next slide. Another challenge in debates about taxes is that they are often in kind of a zero-sum game or only in the moment. And as Ann mentioned earlier, we're kind of in an austerity phase at the moment. And it's hard for people to look past what they feel like they can and cannot afford at the moment. And some other research that we helped sponsor really suggested that it's important to help people remember that the things we use today all around us were actually paid for by our parents and grandparents, and that it is our kind of responsibility and civic duty, if you will, to pay it forward and to think about taxes we're paying today as building those systems that our children and grandchildren will use and rely upon. So getting kind of just out of that moment in time when people don't think we have the money right now to spend it on and help stretch that perspective backwards to history and forward to what we're trying to create is another one of the things that we have to work on. And there's some ideas, as I said, in our downloadable things about taxes to help you think about how you might do that. And then lastly, we also have to not fuel the kind of bad frames and stereotypes about taxes that are out there. So the next slide there is we really encourage people to avoid using terms like tax burden and tax relief or people's hard-earned tax dollars. And we even encourage people to second guess when they might use the term taxpayer. One of the challenges in thinking about and talking about people as taxpayers is it relegates their role only to check writer. I stumbled on this when I was helping with some people with an op-ed around education funding actually in Washington State. And the closing line was something like, and it will benefit all the taxpayers of Washington State. But again, that has the I think, unintended consequence of focusing the conversation just on the money and not on what is going to be achieved through the state as a whole. So trying to replace that sentence with something like all the people and communities in the state will benefit might be a better choice. So catching ourselves in some of the kind of dominant frames that are out there is also important. So that's a quick overview of a few of the things that we engage in about how people think and reason about government and what we think the implications are for conversations about revenue. Happy to answer any questions as we get to the end of this webinar. And again, feel free to use our website as a resource. Thank you, Anna Kirk.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrick. That's very helpful information. And as we've all experienced, the way we say something has an enormous impact on how other people hear and respond to what we're saying. So that's certainly the case when we're talking about government and taxes, and that's very helpful information. Thank you. So we're getting toward the end of our webinar today. And in this final section, I just want to quickly introduce people to the new Investing in the Future section of the Opportunity to Learn website, which I think is going to pop up on your screen very shortly. Much of what we've been hearing in the webinar so far today comes from or is echoed in the materials on this new section of the OTL website. But we want to walk people through the website a little bit so they have a sense of where this material lives online, if you want to return to it, and we hope you do, and so you can explore some of these topics in greater depth. So let's look at the new homepage, which should be up on your screens. What you can see is at the very top of your screen, you have the OTL website navigation bar in blue. And then below that, you have the sort of Investing in the Future banner and the homepage below that. You have a number of ways to navigate to the various areas of the Investing in the Future site. You can use the navigation bar in green along the top there with 5 clickable tabs along the top. And you also have sidebars and subbars. So as we scroll down the page, you can see there are clickable links along the side, and down at the bottom there are clickable boxes that can take you to different areas of the site. Some of what we've talked about today, including general discussions of taxes, economic issues, and some of the communications and messaging information you can find in the Introduction and Background Basics sections, which if we scroll up to the top, you'll see those two links there in the navigation bar. But because we've already talked about a lot of that, or at least touched on it, let's take a quick look instead at the three other areas of the site: the policy solutions, the resources and experts, and stories from the states. So first on the policy solutions homepage, you can click through to that, and we're looking at it now. You can see that there are 9 categories of policy options, from income tax options to various business tax options to federal options. And each one of these categories looks at a single distinct set of revenue raising options. And just a quick note, every one of the options listed on the site meets 3 basic criteria. 1, it's capable of raising meaningful amounts of revenue. 2, it's progressive in its net effect. And 3, it's within the bounds of political feasibility. So now let's take a look at one of these categories just to understand an example of this. And let's look at the millionaire's tax. So if you click on that box, you'll come through to a landing page for the millionaire's tax. And at the top of it, it offers an overview and explanation of the bigger issues involved in this area of tax policy. In this case, discussions about generating new revenue from high-end income taxes. And then as you scroll down the page, you come to various methods of implementation and little sort of boxes. Each one is a particular method, which gives specific information about different possible tax law changes related to this option, including in many cases which states can benefit from a given tax law change, and oftentimes rough estimates of the amount of revenue such a change would generate. So that's all very good and useful information, hopefully presented in an accessible and even an interesting manner, and I encourage everyone to dig into that and enjoy. But now I want to turn your attention to another feature of the website: easy, clickable access to other resources and experts, some of them in your own home state. So if you scroll back up to the top of the page, we can look along the right-hand side of the page, and you can see some call-out boxes along the sidebar. There's a list of state experts a little ways down, if we scroll down to that, and also a list of national experts. If you click on the state experts, or you go up to the navigation bar and click on the resources and experts link, you will arrive at the homepage that you're looking at now. So let's take a look at that. At the top of the page, you'll see that the best place to start your search for additional information is going to be by connecting with one of the SFAI or EARN group experts in your own state. Those acronyms stand for the State Fiscal Analysis Initiative, SFAI, and the Economic Analysis Research Network, EARN, 2 national networks of state-based research and policy groups. Many of you may have worked with one of these state-level groups before, and if you have, you already know that they're a fantastic resource, very approachable with lots of great information. They have real expertise in these issues and will have an understanding of the details of your state's tax laws and policy environment. So if you go to the end of either of those little paragraphs there's a link, and we can just click on SFAI as an example. And that will bring you to the SFAI homepage, and you can look at your state. If you scroll down there a little bit, there's many states with contact information. So that's a great place to go for information, and we strongly encourage people to go there. There was a question earlier about income taxes in Texas. That's a great place to go and find your SFAI group. You can also look for your EARN group and contact them with those kinds of questions. While we're on this page, just scroll down a little bit to see that for each of the 9 tax option, revenue option discussions, if you keep scrolling down, you'll see that there's again a repeat of the information about the various state experts, policy experts, as well as a grouping of related reports that people can dig into if they want greater detail on the specific revenue option. So those are good resources there. And finally, we'll take just a minute to look at another section of the website, Stories from the States. Clickable link up there in the navigation bar. And we'll hopefully bring that page up in a minute here. There it is. So on this landing page, we have a number of write-ups of revenue campaigns that have been conducted throughout the country. The stories hopefully can help readers understand some of the dynamics of running a state revenue campaign, In each of the write-ups, we discussed the various players, the campaign strategies, various challenges and opportunities that were encountered during the course of the campaign, as well as big lessons that were learned. So we plan to continue adding stories to this page, but at our next webinar 2 weeks from now, on Tuesday, May 7th, we're going to get a sneak preview from folks in California about that state's recent successful campaign to raise billions of dollars in progressive new revenue for public education. And we're also going to hear from folks in Colorado about several recent revenue campaigns that they've undertaken. So those are going to be interesting and valuable discussions, and I encourage people to join us for those. So we're getting close to the end of our time here. We want to have a little bit of time for questions, so I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to Ann and Jocelyn.
Jocelyn, if you want to read questions, and then I have one comment on the messaging, but I want to make sure we do questions first if you have some.
Certainly. This first one is not necessarily a question, but it's a very good comment from Ellen, who shares that she often takes folks that she's working with on sort of a walk through their regular day, which she calls a safari, sort of pointing out different aspects of their everyday life that can be impacted by different public policies. Ellen is asking, and Patrick, this is probably a question for you, is this sort of a useful process and a way of talking about things with regard to taxes and spending? Ellen particularly liked the picture of the protesters against taxes, but then pointing out all the different things that are surrounding them that are supported by taxes.
No, it sounds like a creative idea to actually get people out and lay eyes on the things that their money is supporting and the funding and the community support. So it sounds exactly along those lines of trying to reconnect this conversation to what you're actually getting, or in some cases what you're not getting, you know, what the effects of cuts have been in a more real way. I've certainly seen people do some creative video work with that online, as well as these kinds of events. So good going.
Jocelyn, do you have another question?
Go ahead, Ann. We'll wait.
Well, and it actually sort of is a follow-on here, and thank you, Ellen, for your suggestion, and to tie that to one of the things that Patrick was talking about in terms of reconnecting taxes to purposes. I'd just like to encourage people with sort of a backdrop, because we are getting all kinds of sort of austerity messages. On the other hand, I can't tell you the number of polling briefings I have been in lately as we're approaching the 2014 elections, and the economy is one of the biggest things on people's mind. And another thing is this sort of growing inequality and disparity. And one of the things I know that Kurt opened this with, which is, investing in education really is investing essentially in the economy of the state, in higher wages, in a more competitive workforce, in a future for the state, and certainly a future, if we think about this nationally in terms of sort of, the international competitiveness in a global marketplace. We are all very comfortable, and we should continue to make the moral arguments that we make around, all children deserving this opportunity to learn. On the other hand, the economy is so on people's minds. Making the link in terms of education now, of educating kids, and what happens in terms of the future of the state is a really important thing. The other thing I would like to encourage, and I think it was Patrick also talked about parents and grandparents and having paid for these services, the people who turn out in all elections, this is true in terms of referendum and initiative, and it's certainly true, in candidate elections, are people who are over the age of 50. And most of these people are public education graduates themselves, speaking very directly to older people in terms of their legacy being preserving and protecting and strengthening America's public education, and again, link it back to the economy. So I just encourage you as a strategy in terms of talking to older people, many of whom will not have children in the schools, but will have that link themselves, and linking it in terms of the economy. Jocelyn, if there are not other questions, you want to just sort of reinforce for people the timing of the second one. And also, I just wanted to remind people, if you have either a comment or a question that, pops in your mind before the next webinar, you can send an email to info@otlcampaign.org, And Jocelyn will be getting those and will route them to the different people who are involved in this webinar process. And we will either get back to you or we will make sure that it's addressed very specifically in the second webinar.
All right, thanks, Anne. We don't have any other questions, not that I'm seeing. Again, as Anne mentioned, if you've got any questions after the webinar, please feel free to email us. We're happy to answer your questions and send you off to the appropriate people. Thank you very, very much for joining us. We're going to be having a second part of this webinar. It's going to be happening on May 7th. As Kurt sort of previewed, we're going to be chatting with some of the organizers and some of the orchestrators of a couple different state-level campaigns, and they're going to be able to share the lessons learned, what strategies they used, and all the things that can help you consider exactly how you want to approach this issue of funding your state's public education system in your own communities. And we've been recording this whole webinar, so we're going to be able to post this probably tomorrow or later this week. I will email everyone that signed up for this webinar and let you know. Send you the link to the video and link to register to the second webinar.
Thank you to everyone, and indeed the report that we were talking about is it's otlcampaign.org. You'll find it there, and there's many of the resources that we've been talking about that you can look at prior to the next webinar, and feel free to sort of, virally share with any of your colleagues and other folks working in this arena. Thank you to everyone.
All right, and that's the end of the webinar. Thank you all.
Hey there.